Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about solving proportions. So a proportion, let me actually make that singular. A proportion is a ratio that is equivalent or equal to another ratio. Now remember, a ratio is a fraction, right? One of the most common ways to express a ratio is a fraction. So we have one fraction set equal to another fraction. Let me write the word equivalent here. Okay. So if you look at these two fractions, if you reduce 9 over 12, that actually reduces to 3/4, because if you divide the numerator and denominator by 3, you get 3/4. So ratios are extremely common in everyday life because you have to change maybe the size of something. So for example, maybe you're cooking in light of Thanksgiving, and the recipe that you're looking at requires for, 3 tablespoons of sugar for every 4 cups of butter. I guess it's a lot of butter. But that recipe probably only serves 4 or 6 people. So if you're serving more people than that, you would have to double that. If you're serving like 12 people, let's say, you'd have to double that. Now, hopefully you had smaller numbers for this Thanksgiving, but you get the idea. So if you're cooking for a larger number of people, you would have to change that ratio accordingly. You'll also use ratios in chemistry a lot. Things like, I use ratios when I'm mixing my gas to oil for like my chainsaw or my weed whacker, because they actually require a gas to oil mixture. So ratios and proportions are extremely common in everyday life. So if you look at that first example we talked about, one way to know this is a proportion, and a proportion is one ratio or fraction set equal to another ratio or fraction. So one way we did is if you reduce 9 over 12, that actually reduces to 3/4. So you could reduce each fraction and see if they're equal, or there's another way to actually prove whether two fractions that equal to one another is a proportion. And the other way is to take the product of the means, multiply these, times what's called the product of the extremes. Okay? So, and I probably actually drew that the wrong way I said it. These would actually be the product of the extremes. You don't have to really know that necessarily. And then usually this way is the product of the means, because usually these are the lowest and highest numbers. But that's not really important. So you cross multiply and take your two answers and set them equal to one another. And if they are equal, it's a proportion. That's another way to prove it's a proportion. So if we multiply 6 times 49, we get 294. And if we multiply 30 times 7, we get 210. Well, these are not equal, so therefore, no, this is not a proportion. Now, also, if you reduce this actually can't reduce, so it can't reduce to 7 over 6, so it's also not a proportion that way as well. Now, let's look at number 2. So we could reduce each of these if we want to. Actually, if we reduce this one by 18, and that's pretty tough to see that 18 is the biggest number that goes into both of those, but if you reduce that by 18, you do get 3/8. But the easiest way to see whether it's proportion or not is to cross multiply. So if we take 8 times 54, the product of the means there, we get 432. And if we take the product of the extremes, 144 times 3, we also get 432. So therefore, we prove that this is a proportion. Okay? So the way I just showed you is probably the easiest way you would solve for a proportion as well. So let's say we're trying to find the value of x that makes these two fractions equivalent. So what we can do is cross multiply. So we take the product of the means, 5 times x is 5x, and you always set that equal to the other product. So 55 times 4, and you get 220. So again, you always take your two products and set them equal to one another, and what you want is an equation. Okay? So basically in one step, and this is why I love mathematics, because a lot of things are, and everything's really related. In your first step, when you cross multiply, you make it into an equation. And then you're just back to our skills that we know with solving equations. And you'll solve equations throughout algebra and mathematics. That will never, ever go away. So we divide both sides by 5 here. Hopefully you see the relationship. And you get 44. Okay? So that's probably the easiest way to solve this. There's another way to do these problems too. But as the values do not become integers anymore, it becomes more difficult to do them the other way. So one of the most effective ways to solve a proportion is to cross multiply, take your two answers, and set them equal to one another, and then solve the equation. So let's look at another example. We have 7 over 11 equals 39 over x. So we cross multiply, product of the extremes, 7x. That's going to equal to the product of the means, 39 times 11. We get 429. And now to finish solving this problem, solving this equation now, we divide both sides by 7. At this point, it's just solving the equation. Now, normally in mathematics, and for most of this course, I have you guys, we would leave this as a fraction in lowest terms. But since we already have two fractions and we're talking about proportions, we're going to, if it doesn't work out to be an integer, we're going to round it to the nearest hundredths place. So if we put that in your calculator, it's about, divide it out, it's about 61.2857. So we're rounding to the hundredths place, so that's 5 is going to bump that up to by 1. So about 61.29. Okay? So again, if it doesn't work out to be an integer, round it to the nearest hundredths place. And we will use decimals for proportions since both of the left-hand side and the right-hand side are a ratio or ratios or fractions. So what about a problem like this? Uh-oh. Well, it's not that bad. You guys know how to do all this stuff. So we take the product of the extremes. We get 35. Doesn't matter what side you put each answer on. And now 4 times that numerator. Well, you have to make sure the 4 gets multiplied to both of those. So if you have more than one term in a numerator or denominator, just put it in parentheses. So I'm going to write it out before I multiply it. So, and now we can solve it. So again, if you have more than one term, see here's one term, here's another term. If you have more than one term in the numerator and denominator, in a numerator or denominator, just put that quantity in parentheses and then distribute to it. So now we can solve 4x minus 12 equals 35. And now we have a very easy two-step equation. Add 12 to both sides. 4x equals 47. And divide by 4. X equals, you should be able to estimate that answer right now. It's going to be about 12, right? A little bit less than 12. So 11.75. I don't have to round that one to the hundredths place because it actually stops in the hundredths place. Okay? Yikes. Guess what, guys? It's not that bad. 10 times this numerator equals 4 times that numerator. Okay? So because the numerator of each fraction has more than one term in it, put those in parentheses. Okay? So 10 times the quantity, 3x minus 12, that's equal to the product of the extreme, which is 4 times the quantity, x plus 7. So now this should be very familiar to you. It's just solving equations. You'll solve equations throughout the rest of your high school mathematics career, especially if you take like analysis or calculus or geometry. You'll always solve equations. So we distribute here, 30x minus 20. Distribute right here, 4x plus 28. Okay? So now we have to get our variable terms on the same side. After you distribute and combine like terms, there's no like terms on each side. So now we get our variable terms on the same side. Best way to do that is to subtract 4x from both sides. You could also subtract 30x, but you're then making it negative, which is fine. Now it's a two-step equation. Add 20 to both sides. So we have 26x equals 48. Last step is divide both sides by 26. Type in your calculator and round to the nearest hundredths place. Now again, a lot of times in this course we left it as a fraction in lowest terms to get an exact answer. Because we're doing ratios, we're going to use decimals here, round to the nearest hundredths place. My calculator says 1.846. So if we round to the hundredths place, it's going to be about 1.85. Okay? Okay, so here's two proportions I want you to solve. So find the value of x that would make the left equal to the right-hand side. So pause the video, do these in your notebook, and then restart the video once you're done. So the next 20 seconds will be blank. Okay, so hopefully you did these on your own to make sure you're checking for understanding here. The first one is the easier one. So we do the product of the means, 13 times x is 13x. Set that equal to the product of the extremes, which is 63. And now to solve, all we got to do is divide by 13. It's just solving the equation at this point. We know that's not going to actually reduce, so we'll just use our calculator. Remember, we're using decimals for this section. And we get about 4.85 if we round it to the hundredths place, okay? Now, if you take an online program like Khan Academy, they'll actually probably want you to use the exact answer, so you might type in that one. But for my class, if you're doing like a test or quiz for me, I'm going to have you use the decimal just for this section, okay? Because this section is all about like ratios, rates, unit conversions, and proportions, so we're making it more practical, okay? But if you're doing your online Khan Academy assignment, they would probably actually have you type in this answer, which is the exact answer, okay? Just so you're aware of that. Number 2, we cross multiply. 6 times x is 6x, product of the extremes, equals the product of the means. Since there's 2 terms in that denominator of the first fraction, I'm going to put that in parentheses to make sure we distribute that 13 properly. So we'll rewrite the 6x, distribute, we get 13x minus 26. And now we got to solve for x. So we have to get our variable terms on the same side. That equation might look a little awkward, but the least amount of steps here is actually subtract 13x because we want our variable term on one side and our constant on the other side. That way we can solve for it. So we divide both sides here by -7. We do know that a negative divided by a negative is positive. Now again, Khan Academy, if you're doing Khan Academy, an online program, you might have to type in the exact answer there, which would be 26 over 7 because that does not reduce. But we're going to use the decimal for right now. We know it's positive. So 26 divided by 7. If we round it to the nearest hundredths place, 3.71. Okay? So proportions. 2 fractions that are equivalent to one another. To solve a proportion, you cross multiply. And basically in one step, you make it into a linear equation that you solve. So thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully you found this video lesson helpful. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. Have a fantastic day, everybody.